the length of your podcast might actually be more important than you think. Also, where your listener is listening to your podcast is kind of an important thing too. Want to know how? I'll show you here shortly. Stick around. Hey there, podcaster. My name is the Shannon, radio broadcaster, podcaster, and a podcast producer. And today's video is powered by Agora Pulse. Now, today what I want to talk to you about is the length of your podcast. I've done a video on this before, but since that video, there's been some research that is updated on the length of podcast and the appropriate length of the podcast, and whether or not you should do a shorter podcast versus a longer podcast. And I will tell you this, should you do a shorter podcast or a longer podcast is really always going to be my answer. It's going to be up to you. But the research is suggesting that longer podcasts are more effective, and longer podcasts are typically listened to in the evening. They're listened to at home. They're listened to after 9 p.m. So this is probably typically after the kids have been set to bed. You've eaten dinner, you've watched all your shows, and this makes sense because most primetime TV shows end around 9 o'clock, and then of course after that you can go ahead and go about your evening and get into something different like a podcast. So longer form podcasts seem to be working better for people who are listening at home. This is what the research is saying from Edison Research. If you're interested in reading more about that and reading more about my thoughts on this, you can go ahead and click a link to my blog that is in the description below if you're watching this on YouTube, and it should be able to break it down a little bit more for you. So let me go ahead and jump into whether or not you should create a shorter podcast. Now, shorter podcasts really now are being looked at as pieces of content that are snackable, that can be consumed in maybe 10 to 15 minutes. And they're typically done possibly in the day. And the reason I say possibly in the day is because that's when people have the least amount of time. People can't consume a content unless they have a really mundane job. They can't consume the content like you would whenever there's full attention in the evening. So when you're creating shorter podcasts and they're consumable, they're snack-sized, it might work for you in the middle of the day. The research is now showing that location also is very important. So someone who may be listening on their commute into work, or maybe they're on the subway, or however, this may affect how long your podcast may be. And again, all of that is in the research, is also on the blog that you can go ahead and read when you head on down into the description. I mentioned in the blog that there was an author, his name I believe was Steve Pratt, and he talks about this idea of longer podcasts versus shorter podcasts, and that's what prompted me to create this video. And in that, it was a Medium article that I read. In that article, he brings up the topic of whether or not podcasters should create their podcasts like a radio station would program their music or program their talk format. And in that article, he brings up a lot of points that I've been trying to bring up to podcasters for probably the past 6 years, because I've always seen podcasting as just another form of radio, another form of creating an opportunity for the podcaster, another form of an opportunity for a podcaster to get an endorsement. If there's something that they use on a regular basis, they can endorse it into their podcast, and it just gives a podcaster the opportunity to be more creative within their podcast, to create things like segments and monetize off of those segments. So in that article, I recommend that you go down and read my blog, and it's linked directly to his blog. I recommend that you go check it out and check out all of the research that he's talking about that is done by Edison Research. But as far as you are concerned, the podcaster, or whether or not you should create a shorter or a longer podcast, you have to think about a couple of things. Is your longer podcast going to be useful for someone to apply the knowledge or apply the content immediately after they consume the content, or is it more along the lines of storytelling where you're just entertaining? You're going to have to figure out how to position your content now. Now, I don't want to make it sound like it's complicated, but now location and the time of day is going to affect this. I can't reiterate this enough. So again, visit the blog and you can read more about that. Now, if you're a brand new podcaster and you're looking to figure out how to do this whole podcasting thing, I've got an essential quick start guide down in the description on, if you're watching this on YouTube, you can go ahead and get down there, click on that, and it'll give you a list of equipment that I use to create high quality podcasts, like as if you were getting it off of the radio station. In fact, people are now tagging me on their setup at home using my setup that I'm sharing in that free PDF and telling me that the setup is the best equipment that you could create a professional sounding podcast. So if you have that set up or you're planning on setting it up, go ahead, hit me up on Instagram. I'll leave that link to my Instagram down in the description below. And of course, if you're still kind of confused on how to use that equipment, I've created the perfect video for you. It's called the Basic Podcast Setup. It's over here on the left-hand side. You go ahead and click on that and it will take you to that video and you'll learn how I use that setup. In the meantime, I would appreciate you guys if you go ahead and subscribe and leave a comment down below if you have questions, and don't forget to hit that bell button to make sure that you get notified whenever I leave a brand new video up on YouTube for all of you guys. Thanks so much for watching. Talk to you next time.